Jeffrey, good to have you here.
Thank you, Paul. Scholarship is for me a communal as well as a personal solitary enterprise. I want to thank Paul Eludes, Ina Rosensfit, and Ken Fuxman for making today possible. And I want to thank the audience, which includes old and new friends, for attending. Your interest and support is a priceless gift. Many years ago, I worked with an alienated teenager who was bullied and felt very alone and estranged from most of the world. Each week, he did something new and dramatic to his body. He shaved the outside of his head. He added a conspicuous facial tattoo. He ripped something off. He listened to raging music that his father, a newly minted psychoanalyst, hated. This only increased the tension and alienation between them, which of course made everything worse. What if you sat on the edge of his bed and listened to his music and asked him what he heard and how he felt about and resonated with the music, I asked. The father just couldn't, which only added to the son's alienation. I asked the son to bring the music into our sessions, which he willingly did. He not only talked about what he liked in the apparently nihilistic music, the honest expression about American hypocrisy, he eventually exposed me to some new jazz, if memory serves, a wonderful song by Horace Silver. Shakespeare was, for me, like that music. He explored what all too many were dismissing or denying about what he called the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. The difficult truths about human life, the way people sometimes treat each other, the pervasiveness of sadism and cruelty, and even the suffering we must undergo, as Gloucester said in King Lear, to see feelingly and then live with greater humanity and wisdom. I first encountered Shakespeare in the late 1960s in high school. It was a time of intense cultural dislocation, ferment, and unsettlement. Like Hamlet, I was disturbed about and alienated from a morally corrupt world with uninspiring leaders. Troubled by a world gone mad, I was interested in anything that might provide sustaining visions and inspiring ideals. Junior year of high school, I had a wonderful English teacher who exposed me to Shakespeare and made him come alive in extraordinary ways. In a certain kind of way, today's presentation and the book I'm completing on Shakespeare is a remarkably late thank you note to David Castan, my teacher, now one of the world's leading Shakespeareans. Shakespeare was and is a cultural touchstone who's played a remarkable and central role in Western civilization, often shedding light on questions we didn't even know we had and helping us see the world and ourselves more empathically and discerningly. You could say from a certain perspective that without Shakespeare, we would be less good at being ourselves. We revere Shakespeare. We also fear him and avoid him. And yet, while we all talk Shakespeare, as Edmund aptly notes in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, think of "To thine own self be true," "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy." Shakespeare's world and words are different than our own and often difficult to understand. In other words, Shakespeare captivates and eludes us. We're fascinated by his work and at pains to understand who he was. After studying Shakespeare in college, I wrote my senior thesis at Princeton on Hamlet and The Tempest and Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot and Endgame. I began training to be a psychoanalyst, and I immersed myself in psychoanalysis and Asian psychology. I just lost my place. Freud and Jung, the Buddha and Patanjali, and people that therapists call clients or patients or analysans all became my tutors in what Jung called the most distinguished and rarest of all the arts, artistry and living. Practicing analysis and Eastern contemplative, meditative, and somatic disciplines for several decades has been a remarkable training in the art of listening. which transformed the way I read, making it easier to hear hidden and latent meanings beneath the conscious surface of a novel or play or piece of poetry or discourse from a client. Some years ago, I re-encountered Shakespeare as part of a self-created great books curriculum to fill in gaps in my ignorance and to return to old friends I had lost touch with. As I read and reread the plays, I tried to listen with the same kind of wholehearted attentiveness and self-forgetfulness that I approach the people I work with in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. I call this an innocent mind, a mind and heart unclouded with a priori assumptions about who the person is or what the text means. If I were to divide my presentation into sections, this section would be called Reading Past the Horror. Did you ever notice when times get difficult, you're in dire straits, and you tell most people about it, that they have trouble staying with it? Superficial suggestions, saccharine comments, all too often substitute for genuinely engaging your pain and confusion. We could think of this as racing past the pain or racing past the horror. I noticed I did this when reading Shakespeare. It's as if we domesticate what we encounter instead of letting its full force touch us. A funny thing happened when I began reading the plays in middle age with more interest in what Shakespeare was presenting than what I assumed was salient. I was intrigued and perplexed by what I read past in high school and college, when I was captivated by the wondrous poetry, the unforgettable characters, and the startling insights. Now I notice predatory and absent mothers, think Lady Macbeth and Volumnia, Coriolanus's mother, and the nowhere present Mrs. Lear and Miranda's absent mother in The Tempest. The betrayals and mistaken and stolen identities became more obvious and important, as did the murderous hostility, think Shylock and Iago and the Macbeths and Richard III, and the moral depravity. Misguided authority and the ethical ambiguity of power were also striking and troubling. Each play, in different ways, illustrated the fact that no character with a clear moral vision had a will to power, and the ones that did have a will to power had no ethics. I also began to notice the unsolvable moral dilemmas. Do they kill Julius Caesar, who seems to be an authoritarian, although he's also deaf and presented as weak? Are they tyrants? Are they helping society? I began also to notice servitude and self-betrayal, think Coriolanus and the sonnets. I noticed exoneration of horror, inadequate governance. Henry V, arguably the most admired of any of the Shakespeare kings, still doesn't do it. I began to notice ambivalence over authenticity. Evil, self-blindness in love, Othello. Mending bad souls, Julius Caesar. Justice versus mercy, Measure for Measure. Intimations of self-healing in the tragedies, and relational healing. Let me use the time now. How am I doing with time? You all asked really great questions before. Thank you. I'm not sure I understood all of them. So a few people I'd like to hear more from to sort of spell it out. Jim pinpointed exactly a crucial issue, which is, if we think of Hans Georg Gadamer, the hermeneutical philosopher, he has a very different idea about what he calls prejudgments. We could call them prejudices. He calls them prejudgments. We all have a need, well, except for those that are bigots, the rest of us have a knee-jerk reaction to hearing the word prejudice or prejudgment. But when you say prejudgment, and if you slow down your consciousness and really listen, an interesting thing emerges, which is we all have prejudgments. When I go to buy fruit, what I buy is based on what I already know. I don't tend to buy fruit that I've never tasted. I don't know what it is. So you could think of prejudgments. Jim might call it identifications, prejudgments. There are inroad into noticing something. Now, they often lead, as Jim and others are getting at implicitly in their questions, they often lead to bias, they often lead to blindness, they often lead to one-sidedness, but they don't have to. So it's a kind of dialectical tension where there are inroad into something, but they could also obscure clear vision. So I began noticing these things in Shakespeare, and the way I tried to read was really the way I try to listen in therapy, which is the minimum of presuppositions. Now, a snarky colleague in academia might chuckle when I say this and say, I mean, and I've written this in my book, Blindness of the Seeing Eye, Psychoanalysis for a Time, Exploring the Blindness of the Seeing Eye. I say there's no immaculate perception. There is no immaculate perception. We can't be agendaless. But what people don't realize enough of is if we're aware of the agenda, at that moment, it's kind of bracketed, and that wedges open a space. I'm really talking about a different way of listening. That wedges open a space where the otherness of the other can grace us, can touch us. And we don't think about that enough. So I tried to read Shakespeare in that way. So recently I finished the chapter on the sonnets, and I didn't read any critical stuff on it. I just started reading the sonnets. And then I saw where I was drawn into and what came out from the text. And I kind of went back and forth between them. And then I don't ever start with an assumption about what I'm going to find or what's in there or what the plays are really about. What I think is, which has been the great danger of a lot of psychoanalytic criticism. I haven't read all of it. I mean, I'm attempting to read all of it, but I've read a lot of it, and it's a disaster. I mean, I talk about this in the long chapter that you first received. It's just a disaster because what it often is it's what I call when I supervise therapists, listening for rather than listening to. So it's starting out with a theory, the Oedipal theory, and then it's looking for confirmation. It's just bad science, really. It's bad science. It's not trying to disconfirm what one thinks. It's trying to confirm what one thinks. It's just bad science and bad work. So a lot of psychoanalytic encounters with literature is that, unfortunately. I think it's pathographies, it's reducing. I'm trying, and I hope I didn't, and I'd love your feedback, not to do that. I am not saying Shakespeare, I'm not trying to reduce him that he is only the problem with his mother, you know, his mother's losses. So his mother lost her mother at 8, and then she lost 2 children very early on. And then Shakespeare was born in the wake of that, which I think deeply affected him. But I'm not saying he's only that. And I'm also not saying the work of art is only that. I'm just trying to point out certain subjective linkages to the work that I think are really, really crucial. Now, to Jim's question, I was predisposed to being able to see that because of my own relationship with my mother. Absolutely. So one of my questions for all of you today, I was going to ask this later, but it seems like it's organically coming up now, is how much to make that explicit. You see, I'd be quite okay making it explicit, except I think that there will be critics who'll say, just another psychoanalyst with problematic relationship with his mother that's sort of reading that into the plays. In other words, it can be used to just reduce what I'm trying to do and not really fully engage what I'm trying to do. So I'm willing to go into that. I'm just not sure how much of it'll be illuminating and skillful. If it'll be illuminating, you know, I would be glad to say a lot about it. But I think that's definitely, Jim, I reread notes from the talk that you gave at the annual conference recently, and I was been thinking about this a lot. And you're all right. There's this tension between this identification is the inroad to understanding, and Leon Edel talks about this. It's the inroad to understanding, but on the other hand, it can be an obscuring force, and you can't get rid of it. It's just there. It helps you notice. I mean, this is what I think has happened, that people have basically read past. This is sort of in a way, Kurtz's the horror of the horror. One of the horrifying things for me is that, and this gets into a little bit of Ina's question about my relationship to Shakespeare. I think people have really missed Shakespeare. It's weird to say that, but I think we've read past it, and I read past it. We love the soaring poetry and the wonderful characterization and the music and the prose, but we don't think enough sometimes, to me, about the content, about all these beheadings and all these betrayals. It's a horrific universe, but I don't know that we speak about that enough. And I think I was alerted to that from, the things that I went through. And I think we need to engage it, because I think in a way there were breadcrumbs that Shakespeare was unconsciously leaving for us to understand him. And I don't think we've really heard him enough. The last chapter of the whole book is called Shakespeare and Me. And it's the conclusion, and it's a dialogue back and forth. I did a little bit of that, played with that a little bit in if you all had a chance to read the Coriolanus chapter at the end of that, I do it. But so this gets a little bit like maybe Peter's question a little bit, although Peter, I want to hear more from you later, because I'm not sure I fully took in everything, the richness of what you said. But if I heard all of you before, how do you in a way cross-check your inroad into the work? How do you challenge that? How do you make yourself not listen for what you believe, but listen to Shakespeare? One way is to look for opposite moments in the text. It's almost a look for confirmation. You know what I mean? Look for where it doesn't work. But what I found when I did that, there were just, a dearth of good mothers. There were often either absent mothers or predatory mothers. So I kept looking for kind of contravening data in the plays, moments where this also gets at what Ken was getting at, I think, although Ken, I want to hear more from you too to make sure I understand. But I tried to look for moments that were very, very different. I tried to look for moments where I thought other themes were salient. But what I kept finding were these stolen identities, betrayals, et cetera, et cetera. And I looked at all this in a way as a gigantic dream. So Freud, Jung, Fritz Perls have talked about, how are we doing with time? They've talked about the way each person, each part of a dream may be shedding light on all of the composite of everything in the dream may be shedding light on all of us. And so in a funny way for me, Shakespeare's plays are a massive cosmic dream, each illuminating moments of him. In Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, he says in the preface or the intro, it's numbered, those of you who know the work, it's numbered paragraphs, kind of thought experiments where he wants you to think out loud with him. It's not a sort of central thesis. And then he says that he's trying to get at the way we use language and the way we think from different perspectives. You could think of them as prisms. So I look at this work as each chapter is a different inroad into an alternative facet of Shakespeare. So chapter 2, Richard III, which you didn't get. Richard III, interestingly, historically is not a terrible leader, and he's not a terrible man at all. There's no evidence that he is. And Shakespeare makes him into this, the most horrific killer. And so another check on my own biases was looking at the way Shakespeare changed his source material and why. I tried to show you that when I talked about Coriolanus, but he really changed it. Volumnia, the horrific usurping mother that got him killed, plays a totally bit part in the source material in Plutarch, the Greek historian. So we have to ask ourselves why. Why did Shakespeare want to do this? So slowly you can start to build up small details. It's what I tried to do in my psychobiography of Freud. Slowly little details build up into a composite picture that begins to get compelling. And I want you to think of this work not as the truth, but just kind of footprints of my own journey. It's not meant as a blueprint for what you should believe. It's just a footprint of what I think I discovered. I think we're about, yeah, thank you.